We've had David Mellor on the show this evening. He said everybody knew about Chris Pincher's proclivities. Everybody knew he was a liability. Everybody knew that he was likely to bring the party and the government into disrepute. And it was, and I'm quoting David Mellor now, typically Boris to put him in a position where he was able to do so. What are your thoughts on that?
Hello, Vanessa, and hello, Peter. First of all, I just think it's sweeping generalisation to say everyone knew of this proclivity and this behaviour. I came into Parliament with Chris in 2010, and I certainly, when I left at 2015, I had no idea. So, it's clear, however, when he was appointed to the Whip's office, the Prime Minister and other senior Conservatives knew that there was a complaint against him, knew that he had now had these claims being made about him. And the judgment of the Prime Minister, as much as anything else at the time, has become part of the story, as we all know. But the idea that every single Tory and backbencher knew about this, I think, is just hyperbole from a man himself, incidentally, of course, who knows what it's like to be on the wrong end of sexual allegations and so forth.
Well, that's why we booked him, obviously, because he was somebody who knew of what he spoke. That was the whole point. That wasn't an accident. But what about the decision to appoint Chris Pincher? It's not as if it could have been news to Boris. We know it wasn't, because we know that there'd been a complaint against him before, and we know that Boris Johnson was aware of it. That's the thing that ended up costing Boris his prime ministership, isn't it? So what do you think? I'm not saying that you live inside Boris Johnson's brain and you can understand his motivation, but what could be the motivation for giving that job to somebody who might put you in peril?
It's interesting, really, because a lot of people, Vanessa, talked about Boris Johnson's sense of loyalty, which I would say loyalty that continues until, shall we say, circumstances dictate that it's no longer time to be loyal. But one thing about Chris that probably a lot of people didn't know is that he was, during Cameron's years, he would be very much organising unofficially as a whip. He was an organiser. He was a backroom organiser. So, for example, when during those days, back in the coalition days, when there was an attempt by the Liberal Democrat partners to bring in the abolition of the House of Lords, Chris was one of the ringleaders organising backbench MPs to vote against it and bring it down. And I think he did 2 or 3 other things. So there was grounds, if you like, to think that he could actually be an effective whip. But these were wholly superseded by the fact that the Prime Minister's judgment was absolutely woeful on that occasion, not to heed what was allegedly well known, and I've no reason to doubt that, and put him in a responsible position. Deputy Chief Whip is a serious position because they have a say in who makes junior ministerial ranks. The Prime Minister doesn't pick every member of his cabinet. It may seem like that to people, but it comes from the Whip's office, and the Chief Whip and the Deputy Chief Whip, which is what Chris Pincher was in that hugely influential position and meant to be an enforcer of discipline, which, given his ability to just behave as he has done and been found out for, was just ridiculous.
What do you make of Chris Pincher's, am I going to call it an apology? I'm not quite sure what to call it. The bit about, well, I'm having medical help and, I'm really grateful to all the people who've been so incredibly supportive of me. Not much said about the victims of the groping, though.
Well, the one I read, he did apologise to the victims. So maybe I read something else, and I was reading it from the Times. But in many senses, right at the beginning, he came out and apologised for this. And yes, it's always a bit creepy, isn't it, when people start to say, oh, I'm getting advice and counselling on how to help with this. It's obvious, easy to say, and I'm not saying it's not true that he's doing it, but the bottom line is he counts for nothing in politics now, except he will be remembered as the man who effectively brought down Boris Johnson, or well, apart from Boris Johnson, that is. So I think that there is no doubt that he regrets it. But what was going on in the man's head that thought he could go to the Carlton Club, behave like that? I'm told he even gave a speech on the evening and behave like that and think that this was okay.
It's an interesting conversation you and I are having, because we keep asking one another what we think was going on in somebody else's head, and it's a very difficult question to answer, but it really does, denote and underline the fact that we are utterly bewildered by Boris's decision to give Chris Pincher the gig and Chris Pincher's decision to go to the Carlton Club and behave that way, particularly as it's impossible not to draw some kind of parallels between the allegations against Kevin Spacey, still not proven, obviously, but of this kind of unwanted, uninvited, unwarranted grabbing and groping, which is a horrible thing to do. Yeah. And the difference, though, Kevin Spacey's alleged offences, if they turn out to have been he's found guilty, happened pre-Harvey Weinstein, most of them, pre-#MeToo. But Chris Pincher's, long after we had discussed this ad nauseam and everybody knew you mustn't be somebody in a senior and powerful position preying sexually on somebody young and junior. It's not allowed, it's not acceptable. He can't have possibly claimed not to know that, can he?
No, and quite honestly, there is a toxicity in Parliament that doesn't affect everyone, by the way. I think we get far too generous about this. But power does go to the head, and you think you're untouchable. We've got countless examples of fallen ministers right across the House who've done things in the true self-belief that they will either never be found out or it's okay because I'm a very important person. They lose awareness. They lose self-awareness, and they, by doing so, they end up causing immense harm and disrespect to other people. There is a power cult. It's a strange place, Westminster, Vanessa, because you are in an elite private club. You basically have lots of people, I wouldn't say fawning over you, but out there to serve and support you. Careers depend on it, special advisors, as Peter will know, but even more junior staff who, you know, everything depends and revolves around the MP. And that can, you know, remember the people we elect to Parliament, they don't have training for this job. They may have run little more in their life than a bath. And actually, when they get into positions of responsibility, they may just fall apart and make dreadful decisions. Which I'm not lobbing, by the way, into the same basket as the sexual behaviour and aggression shown by Chris Pincher in this case, but it kind of is fueled by the same toxicity and in a sense, vulnerability of the system we have that allows an individual to have so much power.
It's so strange, though, because we juxtapose that with, for example, descriptions of the life and service of the late Jo Cox, you know, and she, when you hear what she did, the way she behaved, her attitude to being an MP, the way she served the community, her vulnerability, obviously physical vulnerability, you know, her kind of dedication, altruism, that kind of thing. She doesn't strike anybody when you hear about her and her legacy and what she was like as a person as being someone in any position of power. She sounded as if she was in a position of service. And it's so distressing when members of the public ring a show like mine and say all MPs are corrupt, all they want is power, all they want is to be self-serving, all they care about is being what Boris Johnson's sister said he wanted to be, which is God King. And once they get to be God King, they don't know what the hell to do with it, and they don't know how to behave, they don't really believe in anything. And obviously, as the presenter, I have to be the kind of mediator. I'm trying, absolutely untrue. There are so many MPs who are dedicated and devoted. This isn't fair, it isn't right. But when you say, as you've just said, the power, you know, corrupts absolutely, it sounds infectious to some extent.
It's also to remember, I know Peter wrote a book about the life of special advisors, and I did one, Confessions of a Recovering MP. You don't actually have power just as a backbench MP, by the way. In fact, a councillor has more power than you. It is the perception of power and the use of your position as employer of people, and the ability and influence you have over people's ambitions and careers. And I'm not just talking about MPs, I'm talking about staff across the parliamentary estate, and the perception of the power that you have that corrupts as well. But I make this plea. There are 650 MPs. It is, even though it doesn't sound like it at times, the vast majority of people you don't even hear about because they're not at the wrong end of this sort of behaviour, and they are doing their job brilliantly from right across the House. And I'm glad you made that point, Vanessa, and it's one we should never tire of making.
Nick, I know you have to go. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us this evening.